By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how one congresswoman tried to make Washington see Cuba not as a policy debate, but as an emergency room running out of power. The hardest part of this story isn't what she found on the island. It's what she ran into when she got home. Settle in. This one matters. April 5th, 2026. Representative Pramila Jayapal steps off a plane after 5 days in Cuba. She's carrying something Washington doesn't trade in very often. Not talking points, not position papers. What she actually saw with her own eyes. Here's what she described. A neonatal ward in a Cuban hospital. Premature babies in incubators, some weighing just 2 pounds. Tiny bodies kept alive by machines that need one thing above all else: electricity. Electricity requires fuel. And for over 3 months, the United States had prevented a single drop of oil from reaching Cuba. That's not her opinion. That's what happened. Cuba produces barely 40% of the fuel it needs. The other 60% must come from imports. In January 2026, President Trump signed an executive order threatening tariffs on any country that ships oil to Cuba. Not just Cuba's government, any country. Venezuela, Cuba's primary supplier since the early 2000s, was already cut off after the U.S. captured Nicolás Maduro. Mexico, reportedly Cuba's top supplier in 2025, stopped shipments too. The tariff threat was too large to risk. The result was total. The island went dark. 3 complete nationwide blackouts in March alone. The grid collapsed on March 21st. The third time that month, the entire country lost power. Hospitals ran on backup generators. But generators need fuel too, and the fuel wasn't coming. Jayapal walked through that. She saw cancer patients who couldn't get treatment because the medication supply chain had collapsed. She saw children missing school because there was no fuel for buses. She saw neighborhoods where the water had stopped because the pumps run on electricity. No power means no water. It's that simple. Now, here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't Jayapal's first trip. She'd visited Cuba in 2024, a quieter delegation with Representative Ilhan Omar. That trip drew Republican criticism, but not many headlines. She met government officials, small business owners, university professors, and families of political prisoners. She left convinced that U.S. policy was making things worse, not better. 2 years later, she went back, and the crisis she'd warned about had crossed a line. She called it, in her official statement, cruel collective punishment. Her exact words: "This is effectively an economic bombing of the infrastructure of the country." But here's the detail that makes the whole policy fall apart on its own terms. On March 31st, just days before Jayapal's trip ended, a Russian tanker called the Anatoly Kulakin docked at the port of Matanzas. It carried 730,000 barrels of oil, the first petroleum delivery in 3 months. Trump allowed it through on a case-by-case basis for what the administration called humanitarian reasons. Sounds like relief, right? Experts told the Associated Press that shipment would yield roughly 180,000 barrels of diesel, enough for about 9 to 10 days of Cuba's daily demand. 10 days, 1 ship. That was the humanitarian gesture. And Trump himself said 2 things about Cuba in the same period that you really need to hear side by side. First, he said, quote, "We don't mind having somebody get a boatload because they need. They have to survive." Then he said, quote, "Cuba's finished." Both sentences. Same president, same country, same month. If you're finding this helpful, hit subscribe. I drop videos like this every week. And the hardest part of this story, the part that explains why nothing changes, is coming right now. Okay, remember how I said the real challenge wasn't what Jayapal saw? It's what she came home to. Here it is. The U.S. embargo on Cuba is not one thing a president can lift with a signature. Portions are locked into law, specifically the Helms-Burton Act of 1996, which placed key elements under congressional control. Full normalization requires an act of Congress. Even if a president wanted to end the embargo tomorrow, he structurally could not do it alone. And the political math is brutal. Cuban-American leaders in South Florida reacted to Jayapal's trip with open hostility. The exile community has wielded enormous influence over Cuba policy for decades. Even Democrats from swing districts in Florida won't touch this issue. Jayapal represents Seattle. She has political freedom. A representative from Miami-Dade simply does not. That makes her both the right person to take this stand and someone whose voice has geographic limits. But the deepest tension isn't even political. It's philosophical. The Congressional Research Service, nonpartisan government analysts, documented something chilling in their analysis of the 2026 executive order. Some supporters of the pressure strategy appear to acknowledge that Cuban civilians may suffer more in the short term. And they back the strategy anyway, because they believe that suffering is what forces political change. Let that sit for a second. Jayapal is arguing the babies in incubators are an accident of policy. a terrible unintended consequence. Her opponents may be arguing they are the mechanism. The pain isn't a failure of the strategy, it is the strategy. The United Nations didn't mince words either. Francisco Pachon, the UN resident coordinator in Cuba, said in February 2026, quote, "The risk to people's lives is not rhetorical." A spokesperson for Secretary General Guterres warned Cuba's humanitarian situation would worsen. Quote, "And if not collapse, if its oil needs go unmet." Every year, the UN General Assembly votes to condemn the U.S. embargo. The vote passes with near unanimous international support. The only countries opposing it, the United States and Israel. The entire world has been making Jayapal's argument for decades. The policy hasn't moved. Now, Jayapal isn't naive. She pointed out that Cuba had made 3 specific gestures in early April: announcing pardons for more than 2,000 prisoners, opening parts of the economy to Cuban American investment, allowing an FBI team to investigate a fatal shooting involving a U.S. flagged boat. She said those signs indicate, quote, "The moment is here for us to have a real negotiation and to reverse the failed U.S. policy of decades, a Cold War remnant." She also introduced legislation, the Prevent an Unconstitutional War in Cuba Act, with Representative Gregory Meeks on March 26th. And she's a co-sponsor of House Resolution 7521, the United States-Cuba Trade Act, introduced February 12th. She's not just giving speeches, she's working every lever she can reach. But the machine has more levers than she does. So here's what you're left with: a congresswoman who has now been to Cuba twice, who returned with sharper language each time, who described incubators, dry taps, empty classrooms, and cancer wards running out of medicine, who called it an economic bombing, who pushed legislation, prepared a formal report, and asked for negotiations. And a system built, structurally, legally, politically, to absorb exactly that kind of moral testimony and keep running. The distance between the phrase oil sanctions on a policy document and a 2-pound baby in a failing incubator is 90 miles. Jayapal walked that distance. The question now is whether Washington will. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe, because next week we're going deeper into a story the news isn't covering the way it should.